Imagine waking up tomorrow morning perfectly sane. By evening, you're locked inside an asylum. Your husband says you've gone mad. Two doctors agree. The gates close behind you, and no one believes a word you say. This wasn't fiction. It happened to Elizabeth Packard. But she wasn't the only woman whose life was forever changed by Victorian psychiatry. Across the 19th century, in both Britain and America, women were committed to asylums by husbands, fathers, and doctors who held nearly unchecked power over their fate. Some of those women were genuinely, severely ill. Many were not ill at all, and almost none of them had any meaningful way to prove which one they were once the gates had already closed. This is the story of how that system was built, who it was meant to help, who it actually trapped, and the women who fought their way back out and changed the law for everyone who came after them. In the summer of 1860, in the small town of Manteno, Illinois, a woman named Elizabeth Packard was living a life that, from the outside, looked ordinary. She was 43 years old. She was the mother of 6 children. She was, by every account that survives her, intelligent, well-read, deeply religious, and fiercely independent-minded. She was also married to a Calvinist minister named Theophilus Packard, a man 14 years her senior, a man she had married when she was barely out of her teens, trusting, as most young women of her era were taught to, that marriage meant safety. For years, that trust seemed to hold. The Packards raised their children together. Theophilus preached from the pulpit every Sunday, and Elizabeth sat in the pews as she had done for 2 decades. But somewhere along the way, Elizabeth's mind began to wander from the rigid Calvinist doctrine her husband preached. She started attending a Bible study led by a more progressive minister. She began questioning ideas like predestination and infant damnation, doctrines that told her some souls, including perhaps her own children's, were doomed from birth regardless of how they lived. She began, in short, to think for herself. And she began to say so, out loud, in front of her husband's congregation. To Theophilus Packard, this was not simply a disagreement between husband and wife. In the world he inhabited, a wife's independent religious opinions, especially opinions that contradicted her husband's own teachings, were not just inconvenient. They were dangerous. And in the medical thinking of the era, dangerous ideas in a woman's head were sometimes treated as a symptom rather than a belief. There was a real diagnostic category at the time called moral insanity, a catch-all term that could be applied to behavior that broke social norms even when a person showed no delusions, no hallucinations, nothing that modern psychiatry would recognize as a thought disorder. A woman who argued too forcefully, who refused to submit, who challenged her husband in front of others, could be labeled morally insane, and that label came with consequences. Illinois law in 1860 made those consequences terrifyingly easy to enact. Under the state's commitment statute, a husband could have his wife committed to an insane asylum without a public hearing, without her testimony, and in some interpretations of the law, without her even being present, provided the superintendent of the asylum agreed to admit her. The reasoning behind this law, when it was written, was almost tender in its paternalism. Lawmakers believed that forcing a fragile woman to sit through a public commitment hearing, to hear herself discussed and diagnosed in open court, would be too traumatic for her nerves. It was framed as protection. In practice, it removed the one safeguard that might have saved women like Elizabeth: the chance to speak for herself in front of a judge. On June 18th, 1860, Theophilus Packard summoned a sheriff to their home. Two physicians had already examined Elizabeth, briefly, and agreed with her husband's assessment that she was insane. She was given no chance to defend herself, no chance to call witnesses, no chance to explain that her only crime was disagreeing about the nature of God. She was taken from her house, from her children, some of them still small enough to be frightened and confused by what they were watching, and transported to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane in Jacksonville. When the gates of the asylum closed behind her, Elizabeth Packard was, by all available evidence, completely sane. She would spend the next 3 years trying to convince anyone who would listen of exactly that. To understand how completely Elizabeth's world had been turned upside down, it helps to understand exactly who she was before that June morning. She had been born Elizabeth Parsons Ware in Massachusetts in 1816, the daughter of a Congregationalist minister. She was educated unusually well for a woman of her generation, having trained and briefly worked as a schoolteacher before her marriage. Those who knew her described a woman with a restless, curious intellect, someone who read widely, argued confidently, and had never been content to simply accept an idea because a man in authority told her to accept it. In another century, in another set of circumstances, those same qualities might have been celebrated. In her marriage to Theophilus Packard, they had instead become a source of growing friction. The specific theological dispute that triggered her commitment deserves a closer look because it illustrates just how ordinary, even admirable, Elizabeth's actual symptoms were. The Bible study group she had begun attending was associated with a more liberal, less rigidly Calvinist strand of American Protestantism, one that questioned the doctrine of infant damnation, the idea that children who died before a proper conversion experience were condemned to hell regardless of their innocence. Elizabeth found this doctrine, as taught by her own husband, morally repugnant, and she said so. She also began to develop and articulate her own theological positions, including ideas that emphasized a more merciful, more universally loving conception of God. None of this involved hallucinations. None of it involved delusions in any clinical sense. It involved a woman with a functioning, engaged mind, disagreeing with her husband about the nature of divine justice. Theophilus, for his part, appears to have genuinely believed, or at least genuinely convinced himself, that his wife's new opinions were symptoms of a diseased mind, rather than simply opinions he found threatening. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates the story in an important way. Theophilus Packard was not, by most surviving accounts, a cartoonish villain rubbing his hands together in delight at the prospect of silencing his wife. He seems to have been a man deeply invested in a rigid theological worldview, a man for whom his wife's rejection of that worldview may have felt like a genuine crisis, both spiritual and domestic. That does not excuse what he did, but it helps explain how an entire system of law and medicine could be constructed around the sincere, if catastrophically mistaken belief that a woman's independent thought was itself a form of illness. The two doctors who examined Elizabeth before her commitment spent, by her own later account, and by the account of witnesses, only a matter of minutes with her, a pattern that recurs throughout nearly every case in this documentary. There was no extended observation, no attempt to distinguish reasoned theological argument from genuine delusion, no meaningful cross-examination of her husband's version of events. The examination existed, in practice, largely to provide legal cover for a decision that had already been made. What happened to Elizabeth inside those walls? Whether the doctors ever truly believed she belonged there? Whether her fight for release would ever succeed? And what it would cost her to win? We'll return to. But to understand why a story like Elizabeth's could happen at all, and why it was, in truth, disturbingly common, we need to step back nearly a century, to the origins of the asylum system itself. To modern eyes, the Victorian asylum looks like a place built for cruelty. But almost nobody who designed the system set out to create something cruel. The asylum, at least in its founding ideals, was meant to be an act of mercy. Understanding that contradiction is the key to understanding everything that follows. Before the 19th century, what happened to a person suffering from serious mental illness depended almost entirely on class and luck. The wealthy might be kept quietly at home, hidden from view, cared for by servants, or confined to a private room, their condition a source of shame the family worked hard to conceal. The poor had far fewer options. Some ended up in workhouses, some ended up on the street, and some ended up in institutions that had existed since the medieval period, the most infamous of which was the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London. Bethlehem, whose name would eventually curdle into the English word bedlam, meaning chaos and confusion, had been housing the mentally ill since the 14th century. By the 17 and 1800s, it had become a byword for horror. Patients were chained to walls. Visitors could pay a small fee to walk through the wards and gawk at the inmates, as though they were viewing animals in a menagerie. Treatment, such as it was, relied on techniques we would now recognize as torture. Bleeding, purging, spinning chairs designed to induce vomiting and disorientation, cold water dousing, physical restraint by iron manacles. There was no real distinction drawn between calming a violent patient and simply terrorizing a frightened one. The goal was control, not healing, because almost nobody in a position of authority believed healing was truly possible. By the late 18th century, a handful of reformers began to argue that this was not only inhumane, but ineffective. In England, a Quaker named William Tuke was horrified after a member of his own religious community died under suspicious and neglectful circumstances at a York asylum. In 1796, Tuke founded the Retreat, a small institution near York built on an entirely different philosophy, one that came to be known as moral treatment. Moral treatment rejected chains and beatings. It proposed instead that many forms of mental disturbance could be improved through kindness, routine, useful work, fresh air, decent food, and an environment that resembled, as much as possible, a stable and orderly home rather than a dungeon. Patients at the retreat were encouraged to garden, to take walks, to eat meals together at a table, rather than being fed like livestock. Staff were trained to speak gently, to reward calm behavior, and to use restraint only as an absolute last resort. For its time, this was radical. It suggested, quietly but unmistakably, that the mentally ill were still human beings capable of dignity, rather than beasts to be caged. The idea spread. Reformers in France, most famously Philippe Pinel, at the Bicêtre and Salpêtrière hospitals in Paris, were making similar arguments and, according to popular legend, literally striking the chains from patients who had been shackled for years. Whether that particular story is fully accurate or partly myth, the underlying shift it represents was real. A growing belief across Europe and America that insanity was a treatable medical condition rather than a moral failing, a demonic possession, or a permanent, hopeless state. This shift in thinking was itself part of a much larger intellectual current, running through the late 18th and early 19th centuries. One that historians often connect to Enlightenment ideas about human reason, natural rights, and the possibility of social progress through rational reform. If the mind was a natural object, subject to natural laws, rather than a battlefield for supernatural forces, then it followed that mental illness might be studied, understood, and ultimately treated using the same rational, systematic methods, being applied with such success to chemistry, biology, and medicine more broadly. This optimism was genuine, and it was not misplaced in every respect. Moral treatment, applied conscientiously, really could and did help many patients, particularly those suffering from milder or more transient conditions, by providing structure, dignity, and a calmer environment than the chains and cages of the previous century had offered. The tragedy of the system that grew out of this optimism was not that its founding ideas were wrong, but that scale, cost-cutting, professional self-interest, and deep-seated assumptions about gender gradually corroded those ideas in practice, long before most of the doctors working within the system fully recognized what had been lost. In Britain, this reforming energy eventually reached Parliament, a series of scandals throughout the early 19th century, exposés of neglect, abuse, and wrongful confinement in existing madhouses, both public and private, spurred a wave of legislation. The County Asylums Act of 1808 encouraged, though did not yet require, counties to build public asylums to house pauper lunatics who could not afford private care. The Lunacy Act of 1845 went further, making it compulsory for every county and borough in England and Wales to provide a public asylum, and it created a body called the Commissioners in Lunacy to inspect these institutions and report on conditions. The intention behind all of this was, again, genuinely reformist. Reformers wanted the mad off the streets and out of prisons and workhouses, where they were routinely mistreated by staff with no medical training whatsoever. They wanted purpose-built institutions, staffed by physicians who specialized in mental illness, a new professional class that would come to be known as alienists, the precursors to modern psychiatrists. They wanted structure, hygiene, occupation, and calm, all of which, they believed, could restore a disordered mind. And so, across the Victorian decades, asylums multiplied at an extraordinary rate. In 1845, England had roughly 20 public asylums, housing a few thousand patients combined. By the end of the century, that number had exploded into the tens of thousands, spread across dozens of enormous institutions, some housing 2,000 patients or more under a single roof. These were not small, intimate retreats anymore. They were vast Victorian complexes, often built like small, self-sufficient towns, with their own farms, chapels, laundries, and workshops, designed to be almost entirely self-contained. This growth reflected something else, too: a genuine and widespread Victorian anxiety about insanity itself. The era was gripped by fears that the modern world, its speed, its industrial pressures, its cities, its moral temptations, was driving people mad in unprecedented numbers. Newspapers ran alarmed articles about a supposed epidemic of lunacy. Doctors speculated about brain fever, about the dangers of too much reading, too much ambition, too much excitement of any kind. Insanity was seen simultaneously as a medical crisis and a symptom of social decay, and the asylum was the era's answer to both. It's worth pausing on just how enormous these institutions eventually became, because scale itself shaped everything about how patients were treated. A place like Colney Hatch Asylum outside London, opened in 1851, was designed to house well over 1,000 patients under a single sprawling roof, its corridors reputedly among the longest of any building in Europe at the time. Institutions of this size were, almost by necessity, run more like small industrial towns than like the intimate, home-like retreat William Tuke had envisioned decades earlier. A superintendent overseeing 1,000 or more patients, supported by a small handful of junior doctors and a much larger staff of attendants, who often had no formal medical training whatsoever, could not possibly give each patient the individualized attention that moral treatment had originally promised. The founding philosophy and the practical reality of the system began to drift apart almost as soon as the buildings were finished. There was also, running underneath all of this reforming energy, an unmistakable class dimension. Public asylums were built primarily to house what the law called pauper lunatics, poor patients whose care was funded by local counties, essentially as an extension of the poor law system that already governed relief for the destitute. Wealthier families who needed to place a relative in care generally avoided the public asylums entirely and instead paid for private institutions or for what were known as single lodgings, arrangements where a mentally ill or simply inconvenient family member was boarded privately with a hired keeper, entirely outside the public system's inspection and record keeping. This meant that the wealthiest and most socially prominent commitments, the ones most likely to involve questionable motives rather than genuine illness, often occurred in precisely the part of the system that received the least oversight. But this same system, built with genuinely reforming intentions, also created the exact conditions that would trap a woman like Elizabeth Packard. Once you build an institution whose entire purpose is to house and manage people deemed insane, you must also build a system for deciding who counts as insane and who gets to make that decision. And that is where things began to go dangerously wrong, particularly for women. Victorian psychiatry, for all its reforming ambitions, was working with an extraordinarily crude and unreliable diagnostic toolkit. There was no blood test, no brain scan, no objective measure of any kind. A diagnosis of insanity rested almost entirely on observation, on behavior, on how a person appeared and acted in front of a doctor, who might spend only a few minutes with them before making a decision that could alter the rest of their life. The broad categories doctors used were, at least on paper, medically coherent. Mania described a state of extreme agitation, excitability, and often delusional thinking, sometimes accompanied by aggression. Melancholia was the era's term for what we would now recognize as depression. sometimes so severe it shaded into what doctors called melancholia with stupor, a state of profound withdrawal and unresponsiveness. Dementia, in Victorian usage, referred broadly to a progressive decline of mental faculties, not specifically the age-related conditions we associate with the word today. There were also more specific diagnoses like puerperal insanity, what we now call postpartum psychosis, a genuine and serious condition triggered by the hormonal and psychological upheaval of childbirth, which could produce delusions, hallucinations, and in tragic cases, violence against a woman's own newborn child. These categories described real conditions. Postpartum psychosis is a recognized psychiatric emergency today. Severe depression and mania are real illnesses that, in the Victorian era, had no effective medical treatment and could indeed devastate a person's life and the lives of their family. It would be a mistake to suggest that Victorian asylums were filled entirely with perfectly healthy people. Many of the men and women confined within them were suffering, genuinely and terribly, from conditions that we would still recognize and still treat, though with vastly more compassion and far better tools than the 19th century possessed. It's worth looking a little more closely at each of these categories, because the specifics reveal both how much Victorian doctors got right in their basic observations and how badly they misunderstood the underlying causes. Mania, as Victorian doctors described it, involved genuine and observable symptoms: race in speech, sleeplessness, grandiosity, and sometimes aggression, a cluster of symptoms that maps reasonably well onto what modern psychiatry recognizes as a manic episode within bipolar disorder. Melancholia, similarly, captured real and often severe depressive symptoms, low mood, withdrawal, loss of appetite, and, in the most severe cases, a kind of profound psychomotor, slowing that Victorian doctors termed stupor, which we would now associate with the most severe end of the depressive spectrum. Dementia, in its 19th century usage, was a broader term than it is today, encompassing a general and progressive decline in cognitive function that could result from age, from repeated illness, or, in a significant number of documented cases, from late-stage neurosyphilis, a condition then poorly understood, but responsible for a genuinely large share of asylum admissions by the century's end. Postpartum psychosis deserves particular attention because it represents one of the clearest instances of a genuine, severe, and time-limited psychiatric emergency that Victorian medicine recognized clinically but could not meaningfully treat. Women experiencing postpartum psychosis could suffer profound delusions, hallucinations, and, in the most severe and tragic cases, acted on those delusions with violence, sometimes against their own newborn children. Victorian doctors correctly identified the close relationship between childbirth and this sudden onset of severe illness, even without understanding the underlying hormonal and neurological mechanisms we now recognize. Asylum admission registers from the period record numerous cases of puerperal insanity, admitted within days or weeks of childbirth, and in many of these cases, patients did eventually recover, sometimes within months, a pattern entirely consistent with what we now understand about the generally time-limited nature of the condition when properly supported. Delusions themselves, the fixed false beliefs that doctors looked for as evidence of genuine psychiatric illness, could take almost any form: religious delusions, persecutory delusions, delusions of grandeur, and Victorian case notes are full of detailed, sometimes almost novelistic descriptions of individual patients' specific beliefs. But this same diagnostic category, designed to identify genuine breaks from reality, could be stretched, as we've already seen with Elizabeth Packard, to encompass sincerely held religious or political convictions that a family member simply found unacceptable, with no meaningful clinical distinction drawn between an actual delusion and an unwelcome opinion. The danger lay in how loosely and how unevenly these categories could be applied, and in a particular set of assumptions Victorian medicine held about women specifically. Victorian doctors widely believed that women's minds and bodies were bound together in ways men's were not, that female biology, the reproductive system especially, made women inherently more vulnerable to nervous and mental collapse. The uterus itself was sometimes cited, quite literally, as a source of instability, a holdover from the ancient Greek concept of hysteria, a word derived from the Greek for womb. Puberty, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause were all treated as periods of heightened risk, during which a woman's rational faculties might buckle under biological strain. A doctor examining a female patient was primed, before he even entered the room, to interpret ordinary distress, grief, anger, or defiance through the lens of reproductive fragility. This created a dangerously elastic definition of insanity when applied to women, behavior that would be shrugged off or even admired in a man. Ambition, stubbornness, outspokenness, sexual desire, refusal to obey, could be pathologized in a woman as a symptom of disease. There was an entire diagnostic vocabulary built around female nonconformity, hysteria itself, used as a catch-all for emotional volatility, moral insanity. The same vague category applied to Elizabeth Packard, which described socially unacceptable behavior, even in the complete absence of delusions or hallucinations. And later in the century, nymphomania, a supposed disorder of excessive female sexual desire that could be diagnosed based on almost nothing more than a woman's perceived interest in men, or even her refusal to conform to expected modesty. Crucially, none of these diagnoses required objective medical evidence in the way we would expect today. A woman could be committed for talking too much, for talking too little, for reading novels considered inappropriate, for religious enthusiasm, for irreligion, for spending money her husband disapproved of, for refusing sex, for wanting a divorce, for simply being, in the language of the era, difficult. The line between genuine mental illness and inconvenient womanhood was, in far too many cases, whatever line a husband, a father, or a doctor chose to draw. Doctors of the era also relied heavily on a handful of physical signs that we would now recognize as having essentially no diagnostic value at all, but which were treated, at the time, as serious clinical evidence. The condition of a woman's tongue, her pulse rate, the regularity of her menstrual cycle, and even the shape of her skull, influenced by the pseudoscience of phrenology, might all be cited in a commitment certificate as corroborating evidence of insanity. A woman who was simply anxious, exhausted, or grieving might present with a rapid pulse and an irregular cycle, symptoms of stress rather than madness, and find those same symptoms used against her as clinical proof that something was fundamentally wrong with her mind. There was also a specific and telling asymmetry in how doctors interpreted resistance itself. A male patient who argued forcefully with his diagnosis might, in some cases, be credited with retaining a degree of rational vigor. A female patient who did exactly the same thing was far more likely to have that same forcefulness read as agitation, as further evidence of the very mania or moral derangement she was accused of. The deck, in other words, was stacked in both directions at once. Passive, quiet women could be diagnosed with melancholic stupor, while assertive, vocal women could be diagnosed with mania or moral insanity. There was very little space in between, where a woman's behavior, whatever it was, could simply be accepted as ordinary. This is the central myth that deserves to be dismantled, and the central reality that deserves to be understood clearly, side by side. The myth is that Victorian asylums were essentially prisons for sane women who annoyed their husbands, nothing more. The reality is more complicated and, in its own way, more disturbing. The system contained both women suffering from real, severe illness who received inadequate and often brutal treatment, and women who were not ill at all, but who had been swept into the same machinery, because the diagnostic categories were so vague, and because the people with the power to commit them, husbands, fathers, and doctors, had every incentive and very little oversight. It's this second category, women who were, by any reasonable modern standard, sane, that brings us back to the question the law itself was supposed to answer, but often failed to. Who exactly had the power to decide? The frightening truth is that across much of the 19th century, in both Britain and the United States, committing another person to an asylum required surprisingly little. In England, the legal framework governing commitment evolved throughout the century, generally in the direction of more oversight, though never enough. Under the Lunacy Act of 1845 and the later, more comprehensive Lunacy Act of 1890, the basic mechanism worked like this. To commit someone, you typically needed a signed order, usually from a relative or person otherwise responsible for the individual, and medical certificates from 2 physicians, each of whom was required to personally examine the patient and record specific evidence of insanity, rather than simply asserting it. On paper, this was designed as a safeguard. 2 independent medical opinions were meant to prevent a single doctor's error or a single family member's malice from resulting in wrongful confinement. The commissioners in lunacy, the body created to inspect and oversee the entire system, deserve a closer look because their existence illustrates both the genuine seriousness of Victorian reform efforts and the limits of what oversight could actually accomplish. Commissioners were tasked with visiting every licensed asylum in the country on a regular schedule, reviewing patient records, interviewing patients directly where possible, and filing detailed reports on conditions, staffing, and any complaints raised. Over the decades, these visits genuinely did catch real abuses. Unsanitary conditions, excessive use of restraint, cases of patients being held well past any reasonable justification for continued confinement. Commissioners had the authority to order improvements and, in serious cases, to revoke an asylum's license entirely. But the sheer scale of the system worked against effective oversight. A handful of commissioners, however diligent, were responsible for inspecting a rapidly growing number of institutions housing, by the century's end, well over 100,000 patients nationwide. A single annual or semi-annual visit to an asylum, housing 1,000 patients or more, allowed only the briefest possible glimpse into daily conditions, and savvy superintendents, aware of exactly when an inspection was scheduled, could ensure that the wards looked their best, and the most difficult cases were kept out of view on the day the commissioners arrived. Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly for our purposes, the commissioners' inspections focused overwhelmingly on the physical conditions and administrative record-keeping of an institution, not on relitigating the original diagnosis that had led to a given patient's commitment in the first place. A commissioner might confirm that a patient was being fed adequately and housed in reasonably clean conditions, without ever seriously reconsidering whether that patient should have been committed at all. The question of wrongful commitment, in other words, sat largely outside the scope of what the primary oversight body was actually designed to catch. In practice, the safeguard leaked badly. Doctors in Victorian Britain were paid, particularly those associated with private asylums, and there was an obvious and troubling financial incentive built into the system. A physician who certified a patient as insane and who happened to also run or be affiliated with a private asylum profited directly from that patient's continued confinement. The examinations themselves were often shockingly brief, sometimes lasting only minutes, conducted by doctors with no specialized training in mental illness at all, since general practitioners were legally permitted to sign the certificates. A doctor who owed a family favors, or who simply trusted the word of a distressed and respectable-seeming husband more than the protest of an upset wife, could sign off on a lifetime of confinement almost as an afterthought. Private asylums, in particular, became notorious for this vulnerability. Unlike public asylums, which were funded by counties and subject to more consistent inspection, private asylums were businesses. Some were run with real medical seriousness and genuine care. Others were little more than profitable warehouses, sometimes disparagingly nicknamed trade in lunacy, institutions by critics, where wealthy families could pay to make an inconvenient relative disappear, quietly, legally, and for as long as the bills kept getting paid. A husband who wanted his wife out of the way, whether because of an affair, a dispute over property and inheritance, or simply a marriage he wished to escape without the scandal and expense of divorce, could, with the cooperation of a compliant doctor, achieve exactly that. The United States, and Illinois specifically, where Elizabeth Packard lived, had its own version of this same vulnerability, arguably worse in some respects. As we've already seen, Illinois law in 1860 allowed a husband to commit his wife to the state asylum without any public hearing at all, so long as the asylum superintendent agreed to admit her, based on the husband's word and a physician's brief examination. Elizabeth herself was never given the chance to speak in her own defense before a judge. The law had been written, ironically, under the banner of protecting women from the trauma of a public hearing. In reality, it stripped away the one process that might have exposed her husband's motives, and it placed enormous, almost unchecked power directly into the hands of husbands. There were, to be fair, safeguards written into these laws, and reformers throughout the century worked to strengthen them. Britain's commissioners in lunacy were empowered to inspect asylums, review patient records, and investigate complaints. And over the decades, they did uncover and correct real abuses. Patients, at least in theory, had the right to send uncensored letters to the commissioners, a right that later reformers would fight fiercely to protect and expand, precisely because asylum staff so often intercepted and destroyed correspondence that threatened to expose wrongdoing. Discharge was, on paper, always possible for a patient who recovered, but the loopholes were enormous, and they consistently worked against women in particular. Consider the practical mechanics of the process itself. A husband who wished to commit his wife needed, at minimum, the cooperation of a family physician who already knew and trusted him, someone with whom he likely had an existing social or professional relationship. That same physician had rarely, if ever, met the wife as anything other than an appendage to her husband's household, and so walked into the examination already primed to trust the husband's account of events over hers. Add to this the fact that a second corroborating physician could often be found through the same social network, sometimes a colleague or friend of the first doctor, and you have a system in which two supposedly independent medical opinions could, in reality, both trace back to a single, husband-friendly source. Financial incentives compounded the problem further, particularly within the private asylum trade. Some proprietors of private asylums were paid a weekly or monthly fee for each patient in their care, fees that continued for as long as the patient remained institutionalized, creating a direct and obvious conflict of interest between a proprietor's income and a patient's release. There were documented cases across the Victorian period of proprietors delaying discharge, downplaying signs of recovery, or simply failing to actively pursue a patient's release once the family's payments were arriving reliably. A patient's continued illness was not merely a medical outcome in these institutions. It was, quite literally, a source of ongoing revenue. A woman's own testimony, once she was inside an asylum, carried almost no legal weight, because the very act of disagreeing with your diagnosis, of insisting you were sane, could be interpreted by staff as a lack of insight into your own condition, which was itself treated as evidence of ongoing illness. It was a closed logical trap. The sane response to wrongful imprisonment, to protest loudly and persistently that you did not belong there, was the exact behavior most likely to be read as proof that you did. Add to this the practical reality that a committed woman typically had no independent access to money, no ability to hire a lawyer, no reliable way to contact anyone outside the institution, without her letters passing first through the hands of the very staff she might be writing to complain about. And the trap becomes almost complete, legally sound on paper, and nearly inescapable in practice. This was the trap Elizabeth Packard now found herself inside. Elizabeth Packard spent 3 years at the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane in Jacksonville, from 1860 to 1863. During that time, she did something that many superintendents found deeply unsettling. She behaved by almost every reasonable measure exactly like a sane woman who knew she had been wrongly imprisoned. She wrote extensively. She observed the conditions around her with a clear, critical eye. She spoke articulately about her situation to anyone who would listen. She refused, absolutely and consistently, to say the words that would have made her captivity easier for everyone else. She refused to admit she was insane. This refusal put her in direct conflict with the asylum superintendent, Dr. Andrew McFarland. McFarland ran the hospital according to the moral treatment principles that had shaped American asylum design, and by many accounts, he was not a cruel man in the way that phrase might conjure. But he, like his era, operated under the assumption that a patient's insistence on her own sanity, especially when that patient had been committed by her own husband and certified by physicians, was itself suspicious. Elizabeth's intelligence and articulateness, rather than working in her favor, seemed at times to work against her, read by staff as a kind of cunning rather than a straightforward, credible testimony. For much of her confinement, Elizabeth was actually housed in one of the asylum's better wards, reserved for patients considered calmer and less disruptive. A placement that, in itself, reflected the strange contradiction at the heart of her situation. She was, by the institution's own internal classification, well-behaved and manageable, and yet that same good behavior did nothing to advance her release, because release depended not on behavior, but on a formal admission of illness she was never willing to give. She later wrote extensively about the other women she encountered in that ward, describing several as women whose only apparent crime, much like her own, was disagreeing too openly with a husband or father. She described others as genuinely, deeply unwell. Women whose suffering moved her, and for whom she felt the institution, whatever its flaws, was at least attempting to provide some measure of care that would otherwise have been entirely unavailable to them. Elizabeth's relationship with Dr. McFarland grew more complicated over time, and some later historians examining the surviving correspondence between them have suggested a strange, uneasy dynamic developed, one in which McFarland seemed, at moments, genuinely uncertain about Elizabeth's diagnosis, even as institutional and social pressure pushed him to maintain it. He was, after all, dependent to some degree on the goodwill of the families and ministers who referred patients to his institution, and reversing a commitment that a respected local minister had personally arranged carried its own social risk. Elizabeth would later argue, in her published writings, that this exact dynamic, a superintendent's professional and social incentives quietly outweighing his private medical doubts, was itself one of the central, structural flaws of the entire asylum system, not a failure specific to any one doctor's character. Life inside the asylum exposed Elizabeth to both the best and worst of the system. She witnessed genuine suffering among other patients, women whose conditions were severe and whose treatment, even under a relatively progressive superintendent, remained limited by the medical knowledge of the day. She also witnessed, and later wrote about extensively, practices she considered abusive, patients restrained, isolated, and in her account, treated more as inconveniences to be managed than as human beings to be healed. Throughout it all, she kept detailed mental notes, and eventually written notes, cataloguing what she saw, information she would later use as a weapon. After 3 years, Theophilus Packard, perhaps growing weary of the arrangement, perhaps under pressure from Elizabeth's family or the asylum itself, decided to bring her home rather than continue her institutionalization indefinitely. But bringing her home did not mean freeing her. Instead, back in Illinois, Theophilus attempted to confine Elizabeth within their own house, essentially placing her under a form of domestic imprisonment, nailing her bedroom windows shut and restricting her contact with the outside world, apparently intending to keep her isolated indefinitely without the formal process of asylum commitment. This was, in a strange way, Elizabeth's opening. Illinois law did not permit a man to imprison his wife inside their own home without legal process, the way an asylum commitment allowed. Friends and sympathetic neighbors, alarmed by what was happening, helped Elizabeth petition for a writ of habeas corpus, the ancient legal mechanism that requires the state to justify a person's detention before a judge, or release them. In January of 1864, Elizabeth Packard finally got the one thing Illinois law had denied her 3.5 years earlier: her day in court in front of a jury with a chance to speak for herself. The trial, held in Kankakee County, became something of a sensation. Elizabeth testified clearly and compellingly about her religious beliefs, demonstrating that her supposed delusions were, in fact, coherent theological positions, points of doctrine on which reasonable people could and did disagree. Witnesses, including some who had known her for years, testified to her good character, her intelligence, and her evident sanity. The defense, representing Theophilus's position, struggled to produce convincing evidence that Elizabeth suffered from any actual mental illness, as opposed to simply holding opinions her husband found intolerable. One especially striking moment from the trial has been preserved in the historical record. When pressed by the defense to explain her supposedly delusional religious views, Elizabeth calmly and systematically laid out her theological positions with such clarity and internal consistency that it became difficult for anyone watching to characterize them as the ravings of a diseased mind, rather than simply the considered opinions of a well-read, thoughtful woman who disagreed with her husband's church doctrine. The contrast between the calm, articulate woman on the witness stand and the insane figure Theophilus had described seems to have been impossible for the jury to reconcile. After deliberating for only a short time, the jury returned a verdict. Elizabeth Packard was sane. She was ordered released and freed from her husband's attempted confinement. Winning her freedom, however, was only the beginning of what Elizabeth Packard would go on to accomplish. Rather than quietly returning to private life, she devoted the rest of her years to public advocacy, writing and publishing multiple books about her experience, including a detailed account of her time inside the Jacksonville Asylum, and touring to speak about the legal vulnerabilities that had made her ordeal possible in the first place. She specifically targeted the laws that had allowed her husband to commit her without a hearing, and she campaigned tirelessly for legislative reform. Her efforts produced real, measurable change. In 1867, Illinois passed a new personal liberty law, sometimes referred to informally as the Bill to Protect Personal Liberty, which required a public hearing and a jury trial before any person, male or female, married or unmarried, could be committed to an asylum, closing the exact loophole that had trapped Elizabeth for 3 years. She continued her advocacy well beyond Illinois, campaigning in other states for similar protections and for laws requiring uncensored correspondence rights for asylum patients, so that a confined patient could always, at minimum, reach out to the outside world for help. Elizabeth also fought on a second front that is easy to overlook: the question of a married woman's basic legal existence. Under the prevailing legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman in much of 19th-century America had no independent legal identity apart from her husband, no right to her own earnings, no independent claim to property, and, as her own case had demonstrated, no guaranteed right even to her own physical liberty. Elizabeth used her public platform to campaign for expanded married women's property rights and for greater legal protections for wives more broadly, correctly identifying that her own ordeal had not been an isolated failure of one bad law, but a symptom of a much larger legal system that treated married women as dependents rather than as full citizens. She testified before state legislatures, corresponded with lawmakers across the country, and self-published her books when established. Publishers were reluctant to print an account so damning of respected medical and religious institutions, funding the print runs herself and selling them directly, town by town, often standing outside courthouses and churches to make her case to anyone willing to listen. Elizabeth Packard's story did not end in personal tragedy. It ended, remarkably, in genuine victory. A wrongly committed woman who fought her way out and then rewrote the very laws that had failed her. But her story also revealed something crucial that the rest of this documentary will bear out again and again. She was far from the only woman this happened to. Elizabeth Packard's case became famous, but across the Atlantic, in Victorian England, a parallel pattern was unfolding again and again among women whose social prominence would eventually make their stories nearly as well known. Georgina Weldon. Georgina Weldon was a singer, socialite, and, by the standards of her era, a genuinely unconventional woman. She ran a home for orphaned and poor children that she also used, controversially for the time, as a kind of experimental music school. And she had a strained, increasingly hostile marriage to her husband, Henry Weldon. In 1878, Henry Weldon, reportedly with the help of 2 doctors, attempted to have Georgina certified as insane and committed to an asylum. What makes Georgina's case remarkable is what happened next. She found out about the plan in advance, likely tipped off by a sympathetic household member, and simply refused to be at home when the doctors and asylum attendants arrived to take her. She fled, hid, and evaded confinement entirely, avoiding the fate that had befallen so many other women in identical circumstances. Rather than disappearing quietly, Georgina Weldon went on the offensive. She pursued a series of lawsuits against her husband, against the doctors who had attempted to certify her, and against others she believed had wronged her, becoming a fixture in British courtrooms for years, at times representing herself with a flair that made her something of a public spectacle and a folk hero to those sympathetic to her cause. She won several of these cases, successfully suing at least one of the doctors involved and drawing enormous public attention to the ease with which a wealthy husband could apparently arrange his wife's disappearance into an asylum, with only the flimsiest medical justification. Weldon's courtroom career became something of a public phenomenon in its own right. Victorian newspapers covered her cases extensively, sometimes treating her with genuine sympathy as a wronged woman fighting a corrupt system, sometimes mocking her as an eccentric attention seeker, a duality that itself reveals how uncomfortable Victorian society remained, with a woman who refused to accept the role of quiet victim. She was famously tenacious, pursuing legal action for years after the initial threat against her had passed, driven as much by a broader sense of moral outrage at the system itself as by any desire for personal vindication. Her case, more than almost any other from this period, entered the popular imagination precisely because it offered something rare. A genuine, public, blow-by-blow victory, fought and won largely on her own terms, in an era when the odds were stacked overwhelmingly against her. Louisa Lowe. If Georgina Weldon escaped confinement through luck and speed, Louisa Lowe was not so fortunate, and her case reveals the darker, more sustained cost of wrongful commitment. Lowe, the wife of a clergyman, was committed to a private asylum in the 1870s after a marital dispute, certified as insane on grounds that she and her later supporters considered flimsy at best, largely rooted in her strained relationship with her husband rather than any genuine psychiatric evidence. Lowe spent time confined in private asylum care before eventually securing her release. Unlike many women who emerged from such ordeals wanting only to forget, Lowe channeled her experience into sustained activism. She became a leading voice in a reform organization called the Lunacy Law Reform Association, campaigning specifically against the abuses of the private asylum system, the system that critics of the era had begun calling, with pointed bitterness, England's private Bastilles, a reference to the infamous French prison stormed during the Revolution, invoking the idea that these institutions functioned as arbitrary, unaccountable prisons for the inconvenient. Lowe's own account of her commitment emphasized a detail that recurs across nearly every case in this documentary: the speed and superficiality of the medical examination that sealed her fate. She described physicians who arrived with an outcome apparently already decided, asking questions that seemed designed to confirm a predetermined diagnosis, rather than genuinely assess her state of mind. Once inside the asylum, she reported experiencing many of the same institutional dynamics Elizabeth Packard had described years earlier on the other side of the Atlantic. Letters that seemed to go astray before reaching their intended recipients. A general institutional reluctance to seriously entertain the possibility that a certified patient might, in fact, be sane, and a slow, grinding sense that the passage of time itself was working against her, since every additional week of compliant confinement could be cited as evidence that she had accepted her diagnosis. Lowe's activism, and that of others in the reform movement, contributed directly to the pressure that eventually produced the stronger Lunacy Act of 1890, which tightened commitment procedures, strengthened the inspection powers of the commissioners in lunacy, and made it somewhat harder, though still far from impossible, for a family member to arrange a swift and quiet commitment. Lowe herself continued writing and campaigning for years afterward, publishing detailed accounts of asylum conditions and lobbying members of Parliament directly, becoming, alongside Weldon, one of the most persistent and effective voices, connecting a personal ordeal to a genuine, lasting change in national law. Rosina Bulwer Lytton. Perhaps no case better illustrates the intersection of marital conflict, political power, and asylum confinement than that of Rosina Bulwer Lytton. Rosina was married to Edward Bulwer Lytton, a wildly popular and influential Victorian novelist, and later a member of Parliament and cabinet minister. Their marriage was, for decades, a public and bitter battlefield. They separated and Rosina, denied custody of her children and financial independence, spent years publicly and often furiously criticizing her husband in print, going so far as to publish a novel widely understood as a thinly veiled, scathing portrait of him. In 1858, this ongoing conflict reached its breaking point in the most dramatic way imaginable. During her husband's election campaign for Parliament, Rosina appeared at one of his public campaign events and denounced him loudly in front of the crowd. Within days, apparently at her husband's arrangement, she was certified as insane by 2 doctors and committed to a private asylum. The commitment ignited a genuine public and press scandal. Whatever the truth of Rosina's mental state, and accounts of her temperament vary considerably, the timing, occurring immediately after a public humiliation of a powerful political figure, struck much of the public and press as suspiciously convenient. The scandal grew loud enough that Rosina was released after only a few weeks, an unusually rapid turnaround that itself suggested the commitment had been more about silencing an inconvenient wife than addressing genuine illness. Press coverage at the time noted the extraordinary coincidence of timing. A wife publicly denouncing a parliamentary candidate 1 week and being certified insane the next. And much of the public commentary treated the sequence of events as self-evidently damning, regardless of what the official medical certificates claimed. What makes Rosina's case particularly striking is the sheer degree of public and institutional power arrayed against her. Edward Bulwer Lytton was not merely a private husband, he was one of the most famous novelists in the English-speaking world and a sitting member of Parliament on the verge of a cabinet appointment, a man with vast social influence and the financial resources to arrange virtually anything he wished. That a man of such standing could apparently move to have his wife certified and confined within days of a public embarrassment, and that it took a full-blown press scandal rather than any internal legal safeguard to secure her release, illustrated just how little the formal machinery of the law actually protected a woman. Once her husband decided she was more useful, silenced than free. She spent the remainder of her life continuing to publicly battle her husband's reputation and legacy, refusing, much like Elizabeth Packard, to simply fade quietly away. The alleged Lunatic's Friend Society. Louisa Lowe and Georgina Weldon were not isolated activists working alone. They were part of, and helped sustain, a broader organized movement of former patients and sympathetic allies, dedicated specifically to exposing wrongful confinement. An earlier organization, founded in the 1840s and known as the alleged Lunatic's Friend Society, had already laid some of the groundwork, campaigning for exactly the kinds of legal safeguards: the right to independent legal counsel, the right to challenge a commitment before a magistrate, the right to uncensored correspondence, that later reformers like Lowe would continue to fight for decades afterward. The society was notable for being led substantially by former patients themselves, people who had experienced wrongful or questionable confinement firsthand, and who possessed a credibility on the subject that no outside observer could match. Their pamphlets and testimony before parliamentary committees repeatedly stressed the same core argument: that the current system offered virtually no meaningful check on a determined husband or family member, who wished to remove an inconvenient woman from society. What's remarkable, looking back across all of these cases together, is how consistently the women involved refused the role society had assigned them. They were meant to disappear quietly, to accept their diagnosis, to be grateful for whatever care they received, and to never speak publicly of their experience again, both for their own supposed good and to spare their families further embarrassment. Instead, Weldon sued. Lowe organized, Rosina Bulwer Lytton published. Elizabeth Packard testified before entire state legislatures. Each of these women transformed the exact mechanism that was meant to silence them into a platform from which they refused to stop speaking. Taken together, these cases, Georgina Weldon's narrow escape, Louisa Lowe's confinement and subsequent activism, and Rosina Bulwer Lytton's scandalous, politically charged commitment, reveal a consistent pattern across both British and American society. Marital conflict, financial disputes, political embarrassment, and simple inconvenient nonconformity could, with the cooperation of a doctor and the machinery of the law, be transformed into a medical diagnosis. And the women who survived these ordeals, remarkably, tended to respond not with silence, but with fierce public resistance, turning their own confinement into fuel for reform. By the final decades of the 19th century, stories like these had circulated widely enough that the reading public across both Britain and America had developed a deep, uneasy fascination with what actually happened behind asylum walls. That public curiosity would eventually be answered in the most direct way possible, by someone willing to walk inside and see for herself. By the late 19th century, rumors about life inside asylums were everywhere. Newspaper readers had absorbed years of scandalous case reports, campaign pamphlets from reform groups, and lurid rumors about neglect and abuse. But rumor is not evidence, and in 1887, one journalist decided to find out the truth herself, from the inside. Her name was Nellie Bly, the pen name of Elizabeth Jane Cochran, a young reporter working for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. Bly proposed an audacious plan to her editors. She would feign insanity, get herself committed to the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York, and report from the inside on what conditions were actually like. The plan worked with almost unsettling ease. Bly checked into a working-class boarding house and began acting strangely, unsettling the other residents with vacant stares and confused, unsettling remarks. It took remarkably little to convince the people around her that something was deeply wrong. She was brought before a judge, examined briefly by doctors, and within a stunningly short span of time, committed to Blackwell's Island as insane, all based on a performance she herself later described as fairly unconvincing and thinly sustained. Once inside the asylum, she simply stopped pretending to be mad and behaved entirely normally, and found, to her own alarm, that acting completely sane made no difference whatsoever to how the staff treated her or how they read her condition. Bly spent 10 days inside the asylum before her newspaper arranged her release, and the resulting exposé, published as 10 Days in a Madhouse, became one of the most sensational and consequential pieces of investigative journalism of the entire century. What she described was damning. She reported spoiled, barely edible food. She reported freezing conditions with inadequate clothing and blankets. She reported patients forced to sit for hours on hard benches with nothing to occupy them, no books, no activities, no meaningful human interaction, in conditions that seemed designed less to heal anyone than simply to warehouse them as cheaply as possible. Most disturbingly, she reported that many of the women confined alongside her showed no obvious signs of mental illness at all, including immigrant women who, she came to believe, had been institutionalized largely because of language barriers and cultural misunderstanding rather than any genuine psychiatric condition. Unable to explain themselves clearly to English-speaking doctors, and consequently swept into the same system as everyone else. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Bly's reporting led directly to a grand jury investigation into conditions at the asylum, and New York City subsequently increased funding for the care of the mentally ill by a substantial margin, along with implementing reforms to the examination and commitment process, meant to prevent exactly the kind of casual, careless diagnosis that had swept Bly herself into confinement. What makes Bly's experiment so significant, beyond its dramatic premise, is how carefully she documented the specific moment her sanity was judged and found wanting. She described the examining physicians as spending only the briefest amount of time with her, asking a handful of surface-level questions before confidently pronouncing her insane. The same pattern of rushed, superficial examination that had already doomed Elizabeth Packard decades earlier on another continent. Once the asylum staff had accepted the initial diagnosis, Bly found that nothing she did afterward could change their minds. She spoke calmly, coherently, and consistently. She answered questions rationally. None of it mattered. The label, once applied, seemed to become self-sustaining, filtering every subsequent observation through the assumption that had already been made. Bly's account also captured something that Elizabeth Packard, writing decades earlier and half a world away, had described in almost identical terms: the way the institution itself seemed to actively resist any evidence that might contradict its own diagnosis. Attendants and doctors, Bly reported, seemed almost uninterested in her, rarely engaging in the kind of extended observation or conversation that might have revealed her sanity, treating the daily management of the ward as a matter of routine rather than ongoing diagnosis. It was, in effect, easier for the institution to process her as already diagnosed than to reconsider a judgment that had already been recorded on paper. The scale of public reaction to Bly's report is worth dwelling on. 10 Days in a Madhouse was serialized in Pulitzer's newspaper before being published as a book, and it became one of the most talked about pieces of journalism in the entire country that year. It contributed to a broader wave of what would come to be known as investigative or stunt journalism, in which reporters, predominantly women, went undercover into sweatshops, prisons, and other institutions to expose conditions the public could not otherwise see. Bly herself went on to a long and celebrated career, but 10 Days in a Madhouse remained her most consequential work, precisely because of the concrete institutional change it produced. Bly's experience crystallized, in the sharpest possible terms, a truth the stories of Elizabeth Packard, Georgina Weldon, Louisa Lowe, and Rosina Bulwer-Lytton had already suggested: that the machinery separating a sane woman from a committed lunatic was often disturbingly thin, resting on brief examinations, social assumptions, and institutional inertia rather than rigorous, careful medical judgment. But Bly's report also opened a window into something beyond the question of who deserved to be there. It revealed, in granular, physical detail, what daily life actually looked like once the gates closed, for the wrongly committed and the genuinely ill alike. Whether a woman arrived at a Victorian asylum wrongly accused, like Elizabeth Packard, or suffering from a genuine and serious illness, once admitted, she entered a highly structured, often rigid, daily existence designed around the era's best understanding of therapeutic routine, and shaped just as much by institutional economy and control. Picture the sound of it first, because former patients across dozens of surviving accounts describe sound before almost anything else. The echo of footsteps and keys along long, stone or tiled corridors, the distant muffled cries of other patients carrying through thick walls at night, the heavy, deliberate clang of locks being turned on doors that would not open again until an attendant chose to open them. Then picture the smell. Carbolic soap and disinfectant layered over the underlying, unmistakable smell of an overcrowded institution, unwashed linens, poorly ventilated dormitories, and, in the more neglected wards, the smell of illness itself, left unaddressed for hours at a time by an understaffed night shift. This was the sensory world a newly admitted patient entered, regardless of whether she belonged there or not, and it alone, entirely apart from any medical treatment, could be enough to fray the nerves of even the sanest arrival. Food was often central to patient complaints across both British and American institutions. Asylums operated on tight, county-funded budgets, and meals frequently reflected that reality. Monotonous, starchy, and, according to numerous patient accounts, including Bly's own, sometimes outright spoiled by the time it reached patients, particularly in the larger, more overcrowded public institutions. Meat was rationed carefully and often of poor quality. Bread, gruel, and weak tea formed the backbone of many patients' diets, a far cry from the nourishing regimen that moral treatment philosophy had originally called for. Bathing practices, intended under moral treatment principles to be calming and hygienic, could in practice become another site of institutional control and, at times, casual cruelty. Patients might be bathed in shared, infrequently changed water, sometimes multiple patients using the same bathwater in succession, a practice justified by economy, but obviously troubling from both a hygiene and a dignity standpoint. Restraint, despite the reforming rhetoric of moral treatment that had specifically promised to reduce or eliminate mechanical restraint, remained a persistent reality throughout the century, though its exact form evolved. Straitjackets, restraining chairs, and padded isolation cells were used, officially as a last resort for patients considered violent or a danger to themselves, but patient accounts from across the era consistently suggest restraint was applied more broadly and more casually than official policy admitted, often as a tool for managing understaffed, overcrowded wards, rather than as genuine last resort medical intervention. Hydrotherapy occupied a strange middle ground between genuine treatment and outright punishment. Advocates believed that carefully controlled water treatments, warm baths to calm agitated patients, alternating hot and cold applications, prolonged immersion in continuous flow baths, could soothe an overexcited nervous system. In gentler hands, hydrotherapy could indeed function as a genuinely calming intervention. In harsher institutions, or applied by less careful staff, The same techniques, including sudden dousing with cold water or prolonged forced immersion, shaded easily into something that functioned essentially as punishment for disruptive behavior, regardless of its official medical framing. Sedation relied on the limited pharmacology available to Victorian medicine. Opiates, chloral hydrate, and later bromides were widely used to calm agitated or difficult patients, a practice that, in an era before modern psychiatric medication, functioned less as targeted treatment and more as blunt chemical management, keeping wards quiet and manageable for an overstretched staff, rather than addressing any patient's underlying condition. Daily routine itself was rigid and highly scheduled, reflecting the era's genuine belief, inherited from moral treatment philosophy, that structure and purposeful activity were themselves therapeutic. Patients rose early, ate at fixed communal hours, and were expected to participate in some form of work. For women, frequently sewing, laundry, or other domestic tasks that also happened to keep the asylum itself running economically, effectively providing free labor that offset institutional costs. Time not spent working was often spent in large, communal day rooms, sitting for hours with little genuine stimulation. Exactly the kind of empty, monotonous waiting Nellie Bly described so vividly in her reporting. Sleeping arrangements varied enormously by institution and by a patient's perceived class and behavior, ranging from private rooms for calmer, wealthier, or more cooperative patients to large, crowded communal dormitories for the majority, particularly in overstretched public asylums, housing hundreds or thousands of patients under one roof. Work itself deserves particular attention because it sat at the very center of Victorian therapeutic philosophy, while also quietly serving the institution's own economic interests. The theory behind what was called occupational therapy, or simply useful employment, held that idle hands and idle minds were dangerous, that purposeful labor restored a sense of dignity, structure, and self-worth to a disordered mind. In practice, this meant that female patients spent enormous portions of their days performing the unpaid domestic labor that kept the asylum itself running, washing and mending linens, working in the institution's laundry, which in a large asylum could process thousands of items a week, sewing uniforms and bedding, and working in the kitchens preparing food for the entire patient population. Male patients, by contrast, were far more likely to be assigned to the institution's farm or gardens, considered more vigorous and appropriately masculine forms of labor. This gendered division of asylum work closely mirrored the gendered division of labor in Victorian society at large, reinforcing rather than challenging the same social expectations that had, in many cases, contributed to a woman's commitment in the first place. Visiting privileges and outside contact were tightly controlled and varied enormously, depending on a superintendent's individual philosophy and a patient's perceived behavior. Some institutions permitted regular family visits and unrestricted correspondence as part of the broader moral treatment philosophy, believing that maintained family bonds aided recovery. Others restricted visits severely, sometimes citing a patient's supposed fragility as justification, but just as often functioning, whether intentionally or not, to isolate a patient from precisely the outside allies who might otherwise question her diagnosis or advocate for her release. For women committed under questionable circumstances, This isolation could be devastating, cutting them off from the very people, sympathetic siblings, adult children, or friends who might have believed their protests and worked to secure their freedom. For a woman who was genuinely mentally ill, this environment, however imperfect, at least offered food, shelter, and some measure of structure that might have been entirely unavailable to her on the outside. For a woman who was not mentally ill at all, who had been swept into the system by a vindictive husband, an overzealous doctor, or a legal loophole, this same environment became something close to a slow, grinding erasure of self. Every act of protest read as further evidence of madness. Every day of enforced routine, another day, stolen from a life she had done nothing to deserve losing. It would be a disservice to history and to the genuinely suffering people who lived through this era to leave you with the impression that every single woman confined in a Victorian asylum was simply a sane victim of a corrupt system. The truth, as is so often the case, sits in a harder, more uncomfortable middle ground. Many women confined in 19th-century asylums were genuinely, severely ill, suffering from conditions that we would still recognize and treat today. Postpartum psychosis, severe depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, epilepsy-related conditions that Victorian doctors poorly understood, and the effects of neurosyphilis and other organic brain conditions that produced genuine psychiatric symptoms. Many doctors working within this system were not villains twirling their mustaches over a diagnosis they knew to be false. They were, by and large, working in good faith, with the extremely limited scientific tools the era provided, genuinely believing that structure, routine, and the therapeutic environment of the asylum offered real hope of recovery. And in some documented cases, patients genuinely did improve and were released, their lives meaningfully helped by the very system that so badly failed others. One case that illustrates this more sympathetic side of the story is that of Mary Lamb, the sister of the celebrated essayist Charles Lamb. In 1796, in a documented episode of violent mental illness, Mary Lamb killed her own mother during a psychotic episode, a genuine, severe psychiatric crisis, by any standard, ancient or modern. Rather than face criminal prosecution, largely due to her brother Charles's devoted advocacy and financial support, Mary was placed under care that included periods in private asylum-like settings, interspersed with periods living at home under Charles's careful supervision, an arrangement that continued with recurring episodes of illness for the rest of her long life. What makes Mary Lamb's story so valuable to this history is not just the severity of her initial crisis, but the decades that followed it. Between episodes, by all accounts, Mary lived a full and remarkably productive life. She and her brother Charles collaborated as writers, together producing Tales from Shakespeare, a retelling of Shakespeare's plays for young readers that became one of the most widely read children's books of the entire 19th century. She maintained friendships with some of the leading literary figures of her day, and those who knew her described a warm, intelligent, and beloved woman, entirely capable of sustained creative work and genuine human connection, whenever her illness was not actively in crisis. When episodes did recur, Charles would arrange for her to enter care voluntarily, and she would return home again once she had recovered. An arrangement built on ongoing consent and family support, rather than the punitive, adversarial commitment process that trapped so many other women in this history. Mary Lamb's case stands in sharp, deliberate contrast to Elizabeth Packard's. Here was a woman whose confinement, at least initially, responded to a genuine and severe psychiatric emergency, not a husband's inconvenience or a wife's inconvenient opinions, and whose ongoing care, however imperfect by modern standards, was shaped by a family member's devotion rather than a desire to be rid of her. Her story is a reminder that the asylum system existed, at its foundation, to answer a real and serious problem, even as that same system so often failed the very people it claimed to serve, and swept up, alongside them, women who never should have been there at all. The difference between Mary Lamb's story and Elizabeth Packard's was not the presence or absence of a diagnosis. It was the presence or absence of someone in a position of power who was actually willing to see the person underneath it. The system, over the course of the century, did slowly improve. The Lunacy Act of 1890, hard-won through decades of campaigning by reformers like Louisa Lowe, tightened commitment procedures and strengthened inspection. Elizabeth Packard's advocacy directly reshaped Illinois law and influenced reform efforts in other American states. Nellie Bly's reporting forced concrete, funded improvements in the institution she had investigated. But reform was slow, uneven, and never complete. Wrongful commitments continued into the 20th century in various forms, and the fundamental vulnerability at the heart of the system, the ease with which social nonconformity could be relabeled as medical pathology, particularly for women, was never fully eliminated, only gradually narrowed.